Who's next? I am Zephy. All right. I am Zephy. How you doing, bro?
Hello. I'm doing fine.
What is your question?
All right. My question is, comparing the perspectives of aesthetics and storytelling, how does your favorite dungeon and raid from World of Warcraft compare to that in Final Fantasy XIV or any other video game?
All right. So my favorite dungeon in World of Warcraft might be, I wouldn't say it's necessarily controversial, but it might be slightly controversial. Could I say that? It's a toss-up between the last 3 dungeons of Wrath of the Lich King. You know, the dungeons that was sort of part of Icecrown Citadel?
Yeah, I remember those.
Yeah, it's a toss-up between those for my favorite. As for favorite raid, that would be Ulduar or ICC. So basically, all of my favorites really come from the Wrath of the Lich King era. Although I would say Firelands is probably up there as well. But if we want to talk about the dungeons specifically, in Final Fantasy, I've only recently gotten into Stormblood. So I've not really, I don't have a lot of experience yet with how... Because you can mark a clear difference between the dungeons of Heavensward and the dungeons of Stormblood. It's like, once they got into Stormblood, they figured out exactly how they want dungeons to work. And it's nothing like the dungeons of ARR or Heavensward. The dungeons for ARR and Heavensward is more similar to that of World of Warcraft, whereas the dungeons for Stormblood really becomes its own thing. But I will say my favorite so far has to be the ghost ship one. I don't know. I don't know if I don't know what the name is of the dungeon, but I'm sure some of the Final Fantasy people in chat can tell me. But it's the first dungeon for Stormblood where you sort of have to, like, your ship gets pulled away and then you Siren Song Sea, something like that. Yes, that was like so much fucking fun. It's just really cool. The aesthetic of it really puts you in this sort of creepy, spooky shipwreck island sort of thing. The music in Final Fantasy for its boss fights, and because here's the thing with Final Fantasy XIV, they take so much care within details when it comes to their content that you don't always see in World of Warcraft. A lot of World of Warcraft, the music is incredible. The world is incredible. The dungeons look fantastic. But oftentimes when you look at those dungeons more closely, a lot of it is just sort of slapped in. You know, so put a bunch of mobs here, put a bunch of mobs here, make sure that there's more than enough mobs. Almost always too many mobs for the dungeons to actually feel cool and fun. You know, like I will say the general mobs in World of Warcraft tend to be overpowering as far as I'm concerned, and I don't mean overpowering as too strong, overpowering in terms of this isn't as much fun as I think I would have had if you maybe add a few more bosses or mini bosses and a little bit less trash into the dungeon.
There seems to be like it's almost overflowing with trash mobs in dungeons and raids.
Kind of feels like they want so much trash that it kind of wastes your time towards the, like, they want you to spend X amount of hours in the dungeon or minutes in the dungeon, and they're achieving that through trash rather than through mini bosses or bosses. In Final Fantasy XIV, for example, most trash packs will be anywhere from 3 to 4, maybe. A lot of the time, like, especially in ARR and Heavensward, you'd get 3 trash mobs in a pack. And that was sort of it, right? It's very rare that you will just get over fucking run with ads. Like packs of 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 ads that need to be killed at the same time. And the ads go down relatively easy. A lot of the ads sort of mirror what the boss is going to be doing. And I have caught a slight thing, and I'm not sure if that is true for all of the dungeons, but it does appear as if every boss in a dungeon forms part of the overall theme of the final boss in a dungeon. So not every ability of every single boss will be the abilities that the final boss have, but on every single one of the bosses, there will be one ability that has either that ability in the final fight or an iteration of that ability in the final fight that will work similarly, right? So it's sort of like, it feels a lot more themed. So there's sort of an approach of, we want this to feel like a full package rather than just a collection of bosses within a single thing. Now, both of these have sort of their draws and their draws and their what's the word I'm looking for? Drawbacks, right? So both of these, the WoW thing is fun because bosses can feel incredibly unique from one boss to the next. The Final Fantasy thing is fun because it tells a story, not just in terms of the physical story being told, but also the bosses pull their own little story, tell their own little story every single time. Aesthetically, though, one of the dungeons that just blew me away was the underwater dungeon in FF14 that I did not too long ago. You're not actually underwater, you're in a bubble underwater, but it is just, aesthetically, it's fantastic. It's like one of the most beautiful dungeons I've ever seen. So really fucking love that. I will have to say I prefer the Final Fantasy XIV approach. I like that it's just 4 people, 2 DPS, 1 tank, 1 healer. It feels like everyone has a job to do, and it feels a lot more balanced, but it also feels a lot more important that everyone stays alive. Because almost always, if there is tactics that need to be followed, you need all 4 people to follow the tactic. So all 4 people will have something that needs to be done. So you're a lot more included. Whereas in World of Warcraft, 5 people, you know, it's sort of the staple and it makes sense. But oftentimes you will have tactics where only 2 people really do anything and one of them just sort of stand there and like do fuck all, right? Because there's nothing to do.
Yeah.
I definitely prefer the mechanics for bosses in FF14, not because they're harder, they're more fun. So Final Fantasy XIV fights is busy as fuck. You can never, like, it's frustrating as a black mage to play, but it's so much fun. You're not bored. Compare that to almost any dungeon non-Mythic Plus in World of Warcraft. The vast majority of bosses in dungeons is basically you standing still for the majority of the fight, finding a little bit of a position, and then not moving for the rest of it. I'm sort of reminded of the dungeon in Shadowlands, where the final boss... What dungeon is it called again? Fuck, what's the name? On the final boss, he pulls in these coffins, and then he shoots the coffins out again. What's that boss called? What's that dungeon called again?
Are you thinking Halls of Atonement?
No, not Halls of Atonement, I don't think. Is it Halls of Atonement? Isn't Halls of Atonement the one where you do that long-ass fucking run where you have to kill things all the way to the boss on the balcony? I'm trying to think. The first boss, so you open up in this massive courtyard, and the very first boss stands in the middle of the courtyard, and you first have to kill the ads. Is it Oh, yeah, that... Okay, Sanguine Deaths is the one that you have to run the corridor. So this would be Halls of Atonement then. Okay, so Halls of Atonement, on that final boss, if you find the correct position to stand in, you literally never have to move again. Like, you can literally stand there for the whole fucking fight. I'm talking normal and heroic version and even mythic normal version, not mythic plus where things change considerably. In Final Fantasy XIV, I am yet to find a fight like that. Now, Heavensward and also even Stormblood. I'm yet to find a boss like that, where you can just sort of find your position and never have to fucking move again. The boss will physically target you with things that mean you have to react, you have to focus. It makes it more fun because that's why we're there. We're not just there to push buttons and, pardon the pun, see who has the most DPS. Well, it's not even a pun. You can't see the DPS in FF14 unless you have an add-on, which you're not really supposed to have. So no one gives a fuck what your DPS is. Everyone just cares, are you following the tactics? Are you doing things correctly? So I'm gonna have to give it to FF14. I prefer it.
Yeah, my favorite, I guess this is kind of cheating because it's got like so many inside it. My favorite like dungeons and raid area is Blackrock Mountain. Just the entirety of it.
Oh, it is. That is. I completely forgot about that, but you are correct. From dungeons to raids, everything in the Blackrock. I've always felt like I would not mind if those dungeons and raids were sort of brought back as, you know, max level content, because they were fun. And aesthetically, you were in a mountain, you know? You felt like you were in a mountain. It was fucking fantastic.
My favorite memory from Blackrock Mountain was the escorting of that one Alliance general out of his cell. Like,
yeah,
that was part of a story where you had to literally go into a dragon's lair in order to stop her from controlling the courts of Stormwind.
Mm-hmm.
And as I delved deeper, more and more into the stories inside of Blackrock Mountain, I was like, oh my god, this is fucking amazing.
Yeah.
Like, my favorite antagonist in all of World of Warcraft has been and always will be Lord Nefarian. He was just one really good schemer.
I would say Gul'dan. I prefer Gul'dan. Like, that dude was just in it for power's sake, man. Gul'dan was fucking amazing. But then, of course, we're not even talking about the thing that Final Fantasy has that World of Warcraft doesn't have, and that's trials. Chat just reminded me of that.
The trials.
The trial system in Final Fantasy XIV is fucking fantastic. And the way they present them to you throughout the story, like from dungeons to trials to raids. Raids is all max level stuff, right? So you only get a raid once you get to the max level. But dungeons and trials are presented throughout the story, and then trials will go on to have larger difficulties throughout the patches. But what's nice about this is you sort of get your quest lines, and then quest lines will end in sort of dungeons or trials. And it gives you a nice little break from just, you know, the monotony of questing. And what I love about it is the sheer amount of dungeons and trials that will be presented to you. Versus in World of Warcraft, dungeons are usually presented at the end of a zone, right? So once you've finished the zone quests, that's where you'll go into the dungeon. And also dungeons aren't required for you to move on with the story. A dungeon is sort of just left, right? So, you know, you may want to do the dungeon, but you don't have to do it immediately. So the way I leveled through Shadowlands was I smacked all of the questing, literally right up until finishing Revendreth. I then had like maybe 3.5, 4 bars to go in order to be max level, and then I just sort of signed up for every single one of the dungeons, and eventually I think 3 or 4 dungeons in I hit max level, and then it was done. That was it.
Yeah, one of the things I like about Final Fantasy XIV is that in order to sometimes do some of the dungeons, you have to do a prerequisite quest.
Yes.
So you understand like the story behind it. In World of Warcraft, you can just queue up, wait for a bit, you're in the dungeon. No quest required, and I kind of wish that there was more of that.
What you just said, I would like to change my answer, and hopefully a lot of Final Fantasy players will understand why. Again, don't know the name of the dungeon, but it's an optional dungeon that you get going into Heavensward, right? It is to unlock flying, so the dungeon gives you ether current. The dungeon tells the story of a group of soldiers that were holed up inside their cathedral and ultimately died due to cannibalism. And now they're sort of roaming the halls of this dungeon. It was, story-wise, I think that was my favorite fucking dungeon. Because the story is so incredibly fucking dark in that dungeon. It's fantastic. So I really enjoyed that dungeon as well. The final boss there was also good fun. So I think it was Dusk Vigil. I think Dusk Vigil is the name of the dungeon. But yeah, overall, I think right now I have my gripes with Final Fantasy XIV. There's definitely things that Final Fantasy XIV don't completely nail. There's mistakes that they do make. But overall, if we're talking about enjoyment and experience, I don't think there is a more perfect game on the market today than Final Fantasy XIV. The overall experience makes it so that the little bit of downsides that you see is forgivable. right? You run into a problem and you kind of go, well, I can forgive this because I'm having a shit ton of fun. So yeah, overall, I would give it to FF. And what I wanted to say about the music is every single boss in Final Fantasy seemed to have their own theme song that plays while you're fighting it, which is also just that little bit of detail that's added to it, just slight detail, where every single boss has a piece of music that fits the fight that you're doing. You know, sometimes it'd be like heavy techno kind of music, other times a very sad sort of song that plays in the background, depending on the story of the character that you're fighting against right now. So it's really cool, and I really fucking like that. But again, it all boils down to that attention to detail that Final Fantasy seems to nail every single time. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. I am Zephy.
It really does. One thing that I kind of wish is that there would be like dungeon bosses that get inspiration from boss mechanics from like other games.
Yep.
I'm gonna draw a boss from Genshin Impact where you literally are fighting against the god of thunder and lightning.
Okay.
And one of her abilities is like she just puts a mass silence on your team for a solid 2 minutes.
Jesus. Okay.
And you have to fight her without using any of your abilities. And when I first tried that, it was like, oh my god, what do I fucking do? Oh my god, she hurts. I just need to survive.
Yeah.
And that's basically it. Once you hit that point, you have to survive for 2 minutes without using any of your abilities or items. And it's like, okay, can we put this in an MMO boss?
It reminds me of that boss in Ulduar. The second to last boss before you reach Accolonn. There's a boss that basically stops all mana generation. Like, you can't generate mana whatsoever on that boss. And you just have to fucking, like, as a warlock back in the day, you're standing there with your fucking wand and you're just wanding the shit out of this boss because you genuinely, like, once your mana is out, it's out. You can't even use life tap to get that mana back because mana cannot be regenerated. It was an interesting fight. It's not necessarily going to be conducive to MMOs, mainly because in an MMO, if you have 2 minutes of silence for a lot of classes, that is just going to be like, what the fuck am I doing now? So it might not work in an MMO, unless, of course, it's something that you can dodge. So it's not guaranteed going to happen to you. You can actually dodge it. In that case, you know, more power to them. Do you have anything else that you wanted to ask, I'm Zephy, or?
Nothing really. I'm kind of having brain farts at the moment.
All right.
But it was nice talking to you.
It was an absolute pleasure. I am Zephy. If you think of anything else that you want to ask, I'll be back next week, as I always am. So I really appreciate you coming out. Thank you so much for the question. And for allowing me to nerd out a bit about Final Fantasy XIV, as if I need a reason to nerd out about Final Fantasy XIV. But I really appreciate it.